all Florida plants going to respond to a changing environment? So when we think of Florida, we may think of beaches and palm trees, but Florida itself is actually a really complicated state in terms of ecosystems and plant species. There are over 4,000 species of plants in Florida alone. So in the Panhandle is the most diverse area of Florida because it has a number of different ecosystems from beach habitats up to hardwood forests. The center of the state is this area called the Central Florida Scrub, where there are a number of endemic plant species, so species of plants that only live right there in Florida. And of course, the most famous part of Florida is the Everglades National Park, which is a completely unique ecosystem with this very marshy habitat. And fewer plants have actually adapted to survive there, so it tends to be a little bit lower in diversity of plant species. So in Florida, they're really lucky because people have been exploring the state for over 200 years and actually writing down information about where plants are. So what we did was gather all the information we could find about plant locality data from a number of different herbaria and other databases. We ended up with over 500,000 data points of plant locality information. And what we wanted to do was say, can we take these data points, build models of species distributions, and then ask, how are these distributions going to change in the future with climate change? So essentially what we did was for every species, take all the points, plot them out on Florida, and then use bioclim layers like precipitation and climate to then build a model of where that species is predicted to be. So for this sedge species, for example, our model demonstrates that it's found mostly in South Florida. So on these maps of the species distributions, the warmer colors are where they're found to be and more likely to be. This scrub palm, however, is one of our Florida endemics, and our model shows is that it's found mostly in the center of the state in that Central Florida scrub. So now we can ask, with future models, what do we predict the distributions to do? And what we find for this sedge species, for example, its distribution actually decreases, whereas for the scrub palm, its distribution could increase. So we had data for over almost 3,000 species of plants. So what we did was then build a heat map and say, for every point in Florida, how many species are there today? And what we get for this heat map is something that looks very similar to the biology of Florida that we know today, with most of the diversity in the Panhandle, shown by the red colors, going down to the Everglades, where we have the least amount of diversity. So now we can ask, how is this heat map going to change over time? And what's hard to see on these maps here is that the red color in the Panhandle is actually decreasing. So overall, we're losing diversity in the Panhandle. And what's happening is that most of the species are actually moving south. So if you look at the green on the southern part of the state, it's actually being encroached upon by the warmer colors. So plants seem to be moving down into the Everglades habitats. So next we wanted to know, well, what's going to happen to our endemics, to the endemics in Florida? So we built a heat map of just the endemic species alone. And for the current diversity, what we find is that most of those plants are found right in the center of the state. And so now we can ask, how are the endemic species distributions going to change over time? And interestingly, what we found for the endemics is that their distributions are going to expand and they're going to move down into South Florida. So you see these warmer red colors moving down into South Florida and again encroaching upon these Everglades habitats. So because we have data going back for 200 years, we wanted to ask, well, what does the data tell us now about how species distributions have been changing? Can we tell, first of all, have they been changing, in which direction, and does that correspond with what we're finding for what we predict for the future models? So what we did was take a sliding window approach, essentially, and say for every year, and for each plant species for which we have data before and after that time period, has the distribution changed, and if so, in which direction? And what we found, especially starting around 1980s and moving into the present, is that the majority of the plants have already started moving southeast, which corresponds nicely with what the future models are showing. So we then built a map just to say, where are all the moving plants found? So where the red colors are showing where most of the plants that are moving are found. So what we find in the past is that the majority of the movement has happened a little bit in the Panhandle and in the south. When we compare this to the future model, so what we predict for the change to be from the future to 2050, the red colors are showing the areas with the most change. These maps actually correspond quite nicely with the majority of the change happening in the Panhandle and in the south. So these results are interesting, particularly for the endemic species, because it suggests their habitats are actually going to, or their distributions are going to expand and grow. But what's going to happen to the Everglades? And one hypothesis that we're following up on is that the Everglades are actually going to start to dry up and produce a habitat that's more like this scrub habitat that's beneficial for the endemics.